It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, I'm not sure you noticed last week that our friend and colleague Al Fromm snuck in a pretty remarkable prediction at the tail end of the program last week. Al predicted, based on history, that the Democrats would lose both the House and the Senate in 2022, despite his preference that that not be the case. So I want to ask you about that, but also connect it to this remarkable moment this week when the Republicans are now trying to basically cancel Liz Cheney, perhaps one of the party's most consistent conservatives. How is it possible for this civil war not to impact the party's performance next year?
Well, good questions to get us going, for sure. You know, if Al and I were still jousting around Washington D.C., I would accuse him of perhaps trying to set the bar way too high for Republicans, so he could come back later just to say they failed to achieve what he had expected. Historically, of course, it is correct. The party out of power with respect to the White House does tend to gain seats. Party in power loses seats. But this is such an unusual year, and there are so many unknowns. First of all, I think a fair assessment would be that the Biden presidency is gaining momentum in the sense of big legislation pending, real domination of the news on substantive issues like the economy, like the pandemic beginning to disappear. And those are the two most important issues, I think. But he's moving on the infrastructure front. The challenge is that the devil is always in the details. So these plans have elements in them that are going to be objectionable to people, certainly to Republicans, some to business leaders who have voiced their opposition. But again, the momentum, I would say, favors the Biden administration, and that Republican leadership is then caught in this crazy internal skirmish. I should acknowledge that I have known the Cheney family for a long time. I admire them a great deal. I don't know that you'll find a more principled group around. They are conservative. Not everybody would agree with them, but they are very principled. And if in the House, if Minority Leader McCarthy thinks he is going to end his frustration with Liz Cheney by pushing her out of the leadership post in an inside baseball kind of drama that's playing out, I think he's deeply mistaken. I think that he will take somebody who is smart, bright, articulate, and turn them into a national critic. And I don't think by virtue of the op-ed today that's running in the Washington Post, I don't think for a minute she is going to shrink from the principles she's decided to uphold, for which, by the way, I admire her. And I think the Republican Party, to get to your question, is going to find out whether playing to this base of Trump loyalists is a path to success. It's hard for me to believe that Donald Trump would, nationally at least, be viewed more favorably in 2022. He's viewed pretty unfavorably right now. I don't think that's going to get better. I think events will tend to work against him. But in these House contests, where there's a conservative Republican bloc of voters loyal to Trump, they may succeed in getting their candidates nominated. But as we've said here before, that isn't necessarily a path to general election victory. And on top of all of this, you have reapportionment where states, big states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, are losing congressional seats. Montana, Texas, other locations are gaining. And then you have this redistricting process, which is too complicated to even go into here, but could really redraw districts across the country. There's a very interesting analysis by Larry Sabato, that Al and I both follow, I know, that says that the mid-decade redistricting probably made the difference between a Democratic leadership in the House versus Republican leadership. So redistricting, reapportionment are big factors here. At the end of the day, I'd say it's too close to call. And now Al can accuse me of setting the bar too low.
Al, the bar too low?
First of all, I just want to clear up a little bit about what I said. I said in the context of the Republicans not talking about any issues last week, I said that they were letting Biden set the perimeters of the debate, but that history tells us that the out party, the Republicans, probably were going to win both houses in spite of that. But I had a caveat. And that caveat is the only way they can lose is if they're still fighting over 2020 instead of 2022. And, I'm going to let Craig explain the Republicans. I have a hard enough time explaining the Democrats. But in the 1980s, Michael Barone, who has moved from our side to Craig's side, and then past Craig to Trump's side, I guess, used to call the Democrats a stupid party because we always did the things that made it harder for us to win national elections. Well, now the Republicans seem to be the stupid party. Basically what they're doing is they've cast their lot, and I don't really think it's much of a civil war. I think the war is over with a loser. And Donald Trump's a loser. In 2018, he was president. He made the off-year election about him, and the Democrats had the greatest off-year they've ever had in American history. In 2020, he lost his election by 7 million votes, by more than 7 million votes. But the party as a whole did better than they thought they would. They did better in the House, better in the Senate, and better in legislatures. They probably still control the Senate if in the two Georgia runoffs, Trump hadn't acted like an idiot and basically tried to make the election about him and whether he won in November, and they lost both seats and lost the Senate. So rather than trying to move on and try to develop an agenda for the future and compete with the Democrats in the battle for where the country wants to go or should go, the Republicans have decided apparently they want to relitigate 2020 for another time. They lost it on election day, the presidential race. They've lost it in the courts, and now they want to try it a third time. That's the one thing I think that could change history and make it possible for Biden, who, as Craig said, has done pretty well with two challenges that are most important: fighting the pandemic and getting the economy back, to do unexpectedly well in the off year. To me, there are two ironies. One is Trump couldn't give a rat's behind about the Republican Party and what happens in Congress. He cares about himself, only about himself. He's built a cult of personality, not a party. And secondly, even if you agree with the Biden policies, and I basically agree with most of them, they're a ripe target for a traditional conservative, for an off-year election. But rather than take that course, the Republicans seem to want to rally around Donald Trump. Parties that control both houses of the Congress tend to overreach, and there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who will push Biden to overreach, and that's an opportunity. But when you choose to fight the election that is passed and over, instead of trying to argue an agenda for the future, it's hard to take advantage of your opponent's missteps. So I don't know what's going to happen, but history says the Republicans should do well. But Donald Trump has the ability to defy history.
Well, we'll see if the big lie works in 2022. Al, let me stay with you. It was also announced yesterday morning that Facebook's board of advisors has decided to keep its ban on Donald Trump in place despite arguments from free speech advocates that this sets a dangerous precedent for the country. Given that the man is now out of office, does it really matter that he gets his Facebook page back?
The fact that he's out of office doesn't really determine his behavior, because he's just as much an insurrectionist out of office as he was in office. I guess my view is, if there are certain limits on free speech. Everybody knows about, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, trying to overthrow the government of the United States and undermine our democracy is probably not something that we ought to have, that ought to be given an easy platform, even for a former president. Some of us who grew up in the Midwest probably too long ago would say it was sort of like giving John Dozier his Tommy gun back. Trump used those social media platforms really to provoke an insurrection. He continues to push the big lie, and his supporters. I mean, I find it incredible, but I guess I shouldn't, because I watched the Democratic Party in the 1970s and 80s. But that whole infrastructure of the Republican Party is now is more and more becoming a Trump party, and I worry about that. Tom Friedman had a column in the New York Times this week saying that Trump did a lot of damage, but now he's going after our democracy. That was sort of the theme of Liz Cheney's op-ed. I guess it appeared today. I read it last night. That's dangerous. And I don't think Facebook ought to help Trump pursue that agenda.
Greg, what's your thought on that?
It seems to me to be a pretty complex set of issues involved. I think we need to be very cautious before we let private organizations decide what can and can't be put out in any format. I say that because I remember the tabloids in the supermarket used to, with some regularity, talk about Martians landing and meeting with President Reagan or talking to the stars or something. I mean, we've tolerated all kinds of strange communication. What we don't tolerate, and what Al's absolutely right about, is the person who yells fire in a crowded theater, and things that are both false and injurious. And that standard, I think, is really what ought to be applied. Exactly how you do it with something as significant as Facebook or Twitter accounts or that sort of thing is a difficult matter. I think that there's just pure unfettered access to people through these social media channels probably is something we have to be concerned about. But then if you start labeling things as false, who makes that decision? Who decides that somebody's views are inaccurate? With Trump, the Washington Post, as probably most of our viewers know, regularly through their Pinocchio scoring system, measured his misstatements, inaccuracies, and outright lies. And the number is just extraordinary. But that's what he's known for. And to the extent that he makes statements that are at odds with reality, it kind of establishes his image. So I do think that, short of complete bans, there ought to be some kind of acknowledgement that when statements are made that are just factually inaccurate, that's cited. If someone is going to use these channels, though, to talk about overthrowing our government, talk about inciting violence, I don't care who they are, whether they're a former president, or a sitting member of Congress, or just some guy out there calling for violent activity. I think those things are typically against the law, and probably do need to be banned. So it's not so much that it's Trump that's saying it; it's what's being said that I think we have to figure out how to guard against where we can, but with being as lenient as we can as well to protect people's right to free speech.
And I think back to through our history the era of yellow journalism and Hearst and really, even the cable networks today. I mean, they basically censor the stuff that goes on, and if you don't agree with them, you don't get on their channel. So it's very complicated, but and I guess Facebook is basically unregulated. Is that not right? I mean, it's basically unregulated. And so to some degree, Mark Zuckerman and the people who have who control who run Facebook, I mean, as a private business, I guess they have some ability to say, we don't want you on our platform.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you very much indeed. We'll see you next week.